of the book is a foundation of breathing that everybody can benefit from. And again, it doesn't matter who invented this or who claims to have invented this stuff or at what time. It's simple practices of breathing through the nose, exhaling more, breathing less, breathing slowly. So that's what I tried to focus on, the general view of this. And if you want more of the specifics, there's already a zillion books on the how-to with hundreds of different practices.
You're just past 8 a.m. at the moment in San Francisco, so I don't know what your normal wake-up time is, but have you done any breath work this morning as a way of preparing for the day ahead?
I'm a night owl, so my normal wake-up time is much later than this, hence the tea over here.
Wow.
But people think that since I studied breathing for so many years, I'd be the best breather in the world, and I'm not. I've got a lot of work to do. But at least the first step about breathing is to be conscious of it and to understand that this isn't something that should just be running in the background, in the back of our minds, but something that we can take control of. So I'm acutely aware of when I'm breathing improperly. I'm acutely aware of then how to fix it. So more intense breath work practices I will do about 3 or 4 times a week, usually at night. But throughout the day, I'm adopting very simple, healthy breathing habits. And that to me is one of the most important things about this. This isn't asking people to go out and run 6 miles a day or to completely change their lifestyle. You can adopt healthy breathing habits no matter what you're doing. If you're sitting in front of a computer, if you're watching Netflix, if you're walking around. And just by adopting those, you can have a transformative effect on your health. It sounds like a huge claim, but I've seen it in the studies that have shown it.
Yeah, brilliant. I think that's a great message for people. So let's dive into something that you have written about, and you touched on it in the conversation so far, nasal breathing, okay? And, for people who've been listening to my podcast for a while, they will have heard me talk about this with Brian McKenzie and with Patrick McEwen, right? But I think we've got a lot of new listeners, and I think it's always reiterating how important it is to breathe through your nose. So what's going on? When someone breathes through their nose compared to their mouth, what is going on and why does it make such a difference?
So when we breathe through our nose, we are humidifying air, we're pressurizing air, we are filtering that air out, and we're conditioning it so that by the time that air gets to our lungs, it can more easily be absorbed, and we can extract oxygen from it. So we know this. This has been proven time and time again, and yet about 25 to 50% of the population habitually mouth breathes. And when you mouth breathe, you get none of those benefits. You can almost think of the lungs as an external organ when you're mouth breathing, right? They're exposed to everything in your environment. And if you live in a city like I do, I don't want to expose my lungs to all those allergens and pollutants. So the quickest way of filtering air and conditioning it is this wondrous organ right in the front of our faces called the nose, and it is completely underappreciated and underused in society.
For asthma, there's primatine mist. When symptoms strike, your airways narrow and there's less breathing. Primatine mist is clinically shown to open airways quickly. Get the #1 FDA-approved over-the-counter asthma inhaler and breathe easy again.
This is the checkers game where grandson and granddad were born. This is the pool where cannonball records will be broken. And this is the kitchen where the new boyfriend will unofficially end. These are the Verbo vacation homes waiting for you to fill with your family.
Remember the stretch, boys and girls.
Find it with Verbo.
Absolutely. So how did you go from, I think I've read you say before, or I think maybe I heard it in an interview, that you used to be a mouth breather. How did you become a nose breather? And is it possible for anyone to actually listen to this and go, okay, I hear you, James, there's all these benefits, I want those benefits, how do I start?
Yeah, I remember breathing through my mouth as a kid. I see pictures of myself when I was young, and I'm breathing through my mouth. Not all the time, but it definitely happened. And even until adulthood, I thought it was normal just to go to sleep with a pint of water by my bed every single night, to wake up every few hours with a dry mouth, take a swig of water, go back to sleep. And I did that for decades till I met Dr. Nyack down at Stanford, and he said, this isn't normal at all. We should be breathing through our nose all the time, especially during sleeping hours. That's a third of your life. And if you're breathing through the mouth, you're just exposing yourself to everything in your environment, and also you're loosening the tissues at the back of your throat and making yourself more apt to snore and have sleep apnea, which is another thing that blew my mind. So, once you realize how dangerous mouth breathing is, you can then take conscious effort to change it, how you're doing, how you're breathing throughout the day. But that won't help you when you're unconscious at night, right? So once I learned this, I was shutting my mouth all the time, practicing nasal breathing. At the beginning, it was very difficult. I felt very congested here, but the nose is a use it or lose it organ. I also learned that from Stanford, that the more you use it, the more it's going to open up. Those tissues are going to acclimate and open up. So I focused on that, and at night, this sounds a little crazy, but I used a little piece of tape, which I still do, just on my lips, to train my mouth shut at night. And this sounds a little, like new age science, but it's not.
New
I
age
heard
torture.
from a breathing therapist at Stanford, and Kearney, who uses it
Seven,
herself,
right?
uses it for her patients. I've had other researchers who do the same thing. And that has helped me tremendously, and it's helped so many other people. It's free.
Yeah, hey James, look, I'm totally with you on that. It is incredible the difference. In fact, I actually spoke to a buddy this morning on the phone who I've not spoken to for a few months, and I said, hey, he was saying, how's the podcast going? I said, yeah, great, I'm actually speaking to someone, James Nestor, this afternoon, you've got to get his book. It's just incredible, it's all about breathing. And he said to me that the thing he changed a few months ago was he started to take his mouth off at night. And he said he cannot believe the difference. He said, I don't wake up thirsty, I'm not groggy in the morning, I've got more energy, better cognition, and I think the people who are skeptical, and I know they are out there, even within my own family, they're skeptics to how important breathing is. I think it really is quite profound what you can feel like. You may not even know how good you can feel until you start breathing in a more optimal way. But it's all about tape over your mouth. Some people will probably feel claustrophobic. The thought of actually taping their mouth shut probably is going to scare them. But you would say it's not like that, is it?
No, and just to second what you were saying, it's one thing to have a subjective experience and say, hey, I feel better after taping, and that means something, right? But it's another thing to measure this stuff. We can measure it, we can study it, we can figure out if it's actually working. And that's exactly what we did, working with Nyack at Stanford. So the measurements from these instruments aren't going to lie. Yes, I felt better, but to me, as a science journalist, it's much more convincing to have data. Because what works with one person may not work with somebody else. And they're finding right now that Stanford and Kearney is booting up a study of 200 people looking at sleep apnea, snoring, and sleep tape. And I so happen to have a little role here. And I want to explain to people that I would highly suggest not going on YouTube and looking how to sleep tape, because there's a lot of really sketchy stuff there. All you need is a teeny piece of tape. I use a piece that big, about half the size of a postage stamp, and I put it right across my lips. I can still talk to you. I can still breathe from my mouth if I want, but it just reminds me when I'm unconscious to keep my jaw shut. And I can take it off with my tongue. So this is not a hostage situation, duct tape kind of thing. This is a teeny
what's it called?
Train shut. And just anecdotally, I've received several dozen emails from people who have had chronic snoring for the past few decades, who have had even mild or moderate sleep apnea, and they've recorded their sleep, and they no longer suffer from those things. So it's not psychosomatic, it's not a placebo effect. That's what happens when you close your mouth and you allow that air to be pressurized, push the soft tissues further back in your airway and open them up to breathe more efficiently. You get 20% more oxygen through a nasal breath than you do through a mouth breath. And if you think that's not going to affect you over the long term, you're nuts. It will have a tremendous effect on your health.
Yeah, absolutely. In your research, you mentioned sleep apnea, and these problems we have, sleep problems are endemic now. Sleep deprivation is an epidemic. There's many reasons for that, of course. But it's really fascinating for me that, I think back, I always try and look at the way we're suffering now, or the maladies of the 21st century, and try and put them in an evolutionary perspective, in a context, and go, what's really going on here? And I don't know, within your research, did you ever come across that sleep apnea and sleep problems are quite a modern problem? I mean, do we know if this existed 300-400 years ago? Was any part of your research on this at all?
Well, we can't go back and test people, but what we can do is look at skeletons. And so I talked to the experts in the field, biological anthropologists, who look at the shape of skeletons. And our ancestors, anything older than around 400 years, maybe 500 years, they would have these very powerful jaws, and they would have these faces that grew outward, and these huge nasal apertures in the back. So from those skeletons, we can decipher that these
What am I doing differently? Because I'm
larger
breaking
airways,
down.
they had more room to breathe. We know that obesity absolutely affects snoring and sleep apnea as well, and people were not as obese as they are now, and that seems very clear and understood. But this idea that our ancestors had these huge, powerful faces and we do not is less acknowledged.
What a
and yet
trip.
it's very